They were kicking the abandoned dog, laughing, until the baby ran and did something chilling. The rain poured relentlessly over the small town of Millfield, transforming the usually bustling main street into a deserted expanse of glistening asphalt. Sarah Collins watched from the window of her modest apartment, her fingers wrapped around a warm mug of tea as rivulets of water cascaded down the glass. The 28-year-old veterinary assistant had always found comfort in rainy days, but today, the weather matched her somber mood a little too perfectly. It had been exactly 1 year since she'd lost her mother to cancer, and the weight of grief still clung to her like a shadow. She took a deep breath, inhaling the steam from her tea, when a movement caught her eye. Through the curtain of rain, she spotted a group of teenagers huddled in the alley across from her building. Something about their posture, hunched and predatory, made her stomach tighten with unease. Sarah leaned closer to the window, squinting through the downpour. That's when she saw it. A small, trembling dog cowering against the wall as the boys formed a menacing semicircle around it. One of them, a lanky boy in a red hoodie, pulled back his foot and kicked at the animal, missing by inches as the terrified dog scrambled sideways. "Hey!" Sarah shouted reflexively, though she knew they couldn't hear her through the closed window in the storm. Without thinking, she set down her mug with such force that tea sloshed over the sides, grabbed her raincoat from the hook by the door, and rushed out of her apartment. By the time she reached the street, her heart was pounding in her ears, nearly drowning out the sound of the rain hammering against her hood. She crossed the street in long strides, splashing through puddles, her focus entirely on the scene unfolding in the alley. "What do you think you're doing?" she called out, her voice stronger than she felt as she approached the group. The teenagers turned, startled by her sudden appearance. There were 4 of them, all boys, probably no older than 15. The one in the red hoodie straightened, adopting a defensive stance. "Mind your own business, lady," he said, his voice cracking slightly, betraying his youth despite his attempt at intimidation. Sarah ignored him, moving closer to see the dog. It was a small terrier mix, soaking wet and shivering violently. A thin, frayed rope was tied around its neck, and Sarah could see its ribs protruding even through its matted fur. The sight made her blood boil. "Torturing defenseless animals is my business," she said, stepping between the boys and the dog. "I work at the veterinary clinic down the street, and what you're doing is not only cruel but illegal." The tallest boy, wearing a black baseball cap pulled low over his eyes, tugged at Red Hoodie's sleeve. "Come on, Jake, let's go. It's not worth it." Jake hesitated, clearly torn between backing down and maintaining his bravado. "We weren't hurting it," he muttered finally. "Just having some fun." "Terrorizing an animal isn't fun," Sarah said firmly. "It's abuse." The dog whimpered softly behind her, and she felt a surge of protectiveness. The rain continued to pour down, soaking through her coat, but she stood her ground, staring unflinchingly at the boys. After what felt like an eternity, Jake shrugged, affecting nonchalance. "Whatever. That mutt's probably diseased anyway. Come on, guys." He turned and sauntered away, the others following in his wake, their shoulders hunched against the rain. Only when they had disappeared around the corner did Sarah crouch down to examine the trembling animal. The dog flinched as she reached out, pressing itself against the wall. "It's okay," she murmured, keeping her voice gentle. "I'm not going to hurt you." Slowly, she extended her hand, palm up, allowing the dog to catch her scent. After a moment's hesitation, it stretched its neck forward, sniffing cautiously at her fingertips. Sarah remained perfectly still, letting the animal make the first move. Eventually, the dog took a tentative step toward her, then another, until it was close enough for her to see the extent of its condition. Besides being severely malnourished, it had several small cuts and scrapes, though none appeared to be from the teenager's brief torment. This poor creature had been neglected long before today's encounter. "Let's get you somewhere warm and dry, shall we?" Sarah said softly, carefully untying the rope from around the dog's neck. To her surprise, the animal didn't resist when she gently scooped it up. Instead, it seemed to collapse against her chest as if finally surrendering to exhaustion. Sarah hurried back across the street, cradling the dog close to her body, trying to shield it from the rain. Once inside her apartment building, she climbed the stairs to the second floor, leaving a trail of water behind her. Mrs. Patel, her elderly neighbor, poked her head out as Sarah passed. "Sarah, dear, you're soaked," she exclaimed, her eyes widening when she noticed the bundle in Sarah's arms. "What have you got there?" "A dog that needed help," Sarah replied simply. "Some boys were tormenting it in the alley." Mrs. Patel clicked her tongue disapprovingly. "Such cruelty. The world isn't what it used to be." Her expression softened as she looked at the trembling animal. "Poor thing. Do you need anything? A towel, perhaps?" "That would be wonderful, thank you," Sarah said gratefully. While Mrs. Patel disappeared into her apartment, Sarah continued to her own door, shifting the dog to one arm as she fumbled for her keys. Once inside, she carried the animal straight to her bathroom and gently set it down on the fluffy bath mat. "There we go," she murmured, quickly grabbing a clean towel from the cabinet. "Let's dry you off a bit." A soft knock at her door announced Mrs. Patel's arrival with several towels and a small bowl of what appeared to be leftover stew. "I thought the little one might be hungry," she explained, setting the bowl down on Sarah's kitchen counter. "You're an angel, Mrs. Patel. Thank you." After her neighbor left, Sarah returned to the bathroom where the dog remained exactly where she'd placed it, too weak or frightened to move. Carefully, she began to towel dry its matted fur, speaking in soothing tones the entire time. "What happened to you, huh? Where did you come from?" The dog offered no resistance to her ministrations, its dark eyes watching her warily. As she worked, Sarah examined it more thoroughly, her trained eye noting the signs of long-term neglect. It was definitely a terrier mix, probably around 2 years old, with what would likely be a wiry tan coat when clean and healthy. No collar, and the rope had left a raw mark around its neck. Once the dog was reasonably dry, Sarah offered it some water, which it lapped up eagerly. Then she placed a small amount of Mrs. Patel's stew in a shallow dish and set it down. The dog sniffed at it cautiously before devouring it with a desperation that broke Sarah's heart. "Easy there," she said softly. "There's plenty more, but we need to take it slow." After it had eaten, the dog seemed to relax slightly, though it still startled at every sudden movement or sound. Sarah created a makeshift bed from a cardboard box and an old blanket, placing it in a quiet corner of her living room. "You can stay here tonight," she told the dog, knowing full well she'd need to take it to the clinic in the morning. Dr. Mitchell would understand. He always had a soft spot for strays. Sarah settled on the couch with her abandoned mug of tea, now cold, watching as the dog cautiously explored the confines of the box before finally curling up on the blanket. The rain continued to drum against the windows, creating a soothing rhythm that gradually eased the tension from her shoulders. As she sipped her tea, her mind drifted to her mother. Marion Collins had been a champion for the underdog, quite literally, as she'd volunteered at the local animal shelter for years. She would have done exactly what Sarah did today, perhaps with even more fire. The thought brought a small smile to Sarah's lips and a familiar ache to her heart. Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her reverie. It was a text from her brother, Michael. "Thinking of you today, sis. Mom would be proud." Sarah looked from the message to the small dog now sleeping in its makeshift bed, its chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. For the first time that day, the weight of grief seemed a little lighter. "Yeah," she whispered to the empty room. "I think she would." Outside, the storm began to subside, the relentless downpour softening to a gentle patter against the windows. Sarah leaned back against the cushions, her eyes growing heavy. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, finding out if the dog had an owner, though the condition it was in suggested otherwise, getting it proper veterinary care, deciding what to do with it afterward. But for now, in this moment, she had done something good. She had made a difference, however small. And sometimes, she reflected as sleep began to claim her, that was enough. Sarah woke with a start, momentarily disoriented to find herself on the couch instead of in her bed. Sunlight streamed through the windows, painting bright rectangles on her apartment floor. The storm had passed, leaving behind a pristine blue sky. It took her a moment to remember the events of the previous evening. The teenagers, the rescue, the dog. The dog. She sat up quickly, looking toward the makeshift bed she'd created. It was empty, the blanket rumpled. A flash of panic shot through her as she scanned the room, worried that the animal had somehow escaped or hidden itself away in fear. "Hello?" she called softly, standing to search the apartment. A subtle movement caught her eye, the slightest shift of a shadow beneath her dining table. Sarah crouched down slowly and found the dog huddled there, watching her with wary eyes. "There you are," she said, relieved. "It's okay, little one." She extended her hand as she had done in the alley, letting the dog come to her. After a moment's hesitation, it crept forward, sniffing her fingers cautiously before allowing her to gently stroke its head. "You're safe here," she assured it, noticing how the dog leaned ever so slightly into her touch. Progress. Sarah glanced at the clock, 6:48 a.m. She needed to be at the clinic by 9, which gave her plenty of time to get the dog settled before heading to work. First things first, a more thorough cleanup and a proper meal. Moving slowly so as not to startle her nervous guest, Sarah prepared a small bowl of plain boiled chicken from her refrigerator, leftovers from her dinner 2 nights ago. She placed it on the floor near the table, then backed away to give the dog space. It didn't take long for hunger to overcome caution, and soon the animal was eating with restrained enthusiasm. While the dog ate, Sarah called the clinic. Katie, the receptionist, answered on the 3rd ring. "Good morning, Millfield Veterinary Clinic." "Katie, it's Sarah. Is Dr. Mitchell in yet?" "Just walked in. Want me to grab him?" "Please." There was a brief pause before Dr. Mitchell's familiar baritone came through the speaker. "Sarah, everything all right?" "Yes, I'm fine," she replied, watching as the dog finished eating and began cautiously exploring the kitchen. "But I rescued a stray last night. Some teenagers were tormenting it in the alley near my apartment. It's malnourished, possibly been on its own for a while. I'd like to bring it in before my shift if that's okay." "Of course," Dr. Mitchell said without hesitation. "Bring it in as soon as you can. I'll squeeze you in before our first appointment." "Thanks, Doc. I appreciate it." After hanging up, Sarah turned her attention back to the dog, which was now lapping water from the bowl she'd set out the night before. In the light of day, she could see its condition more clearly. The tan fur was patchy in places, revealing skin that was red and irritated, likely a combination of mange and flea bites. Its frame was painfully thin, but there was an alertness in its eyes that gave Sarah hope. This little survivor had a fighting spirit. "Okay, buddy," she said softly. "Let's get you cleaned up a bit before we see the doctor." The bathroom situation proved to be less challenging than she'd anticipated. Though obviously wary, the dog allowed her to gently wash it with warm water and mild soap. She was careful around its wounds, noting each scrape and raw patch that would need attention. As the dirt washed away, Sarah could see that the dog's natural coat was a warm wheaten color, though it would need time and proper nutrition to regain its full luster. Throughout the bath, she spoke in a soothing, continuous stream, letting the animal become accustomed to her voice. "You're being so brave. That's it. Almost done now." Once she had toweled the dog dry and made sure it was comfortable in its box again, Sarah quickly showered and dressed. She found an old laundry basket and lined it with fresh towels, creating a secure carrier for their trip to the clinic. "All right, time for a little car ride," she told the dog, gently lifting it into the basket. "Dr. Mitchell is the best, you'll see. He'll have you feeling better in no time." Millfield Veterinary Clinic was only a 10-minute drive from Sarah's apartment. The dog remained surprisingly calm during the journey, peering over the edge of the basket occasionally but making no attempt to escape. Sarah took this as another positive sign. Despite whatever trauma it had endured, the animal seemed to understand on some level that she was trying to help. The clinic was quiet when they arrived, still half an hour before opening time. Katie buzzed them in, her expression softening when she saw the small creature in the basket. "Oh, the poor thing," she said, coming around the reception desk for a closer look. "Those horrible boys. I hope you gave them a piece of your mind." "I did," Sarah assured her, following Katie to exam room 2, where Dr. Mitchell was waiting. Robert Mitchell had been a fixture in Millfield for over 20 years. At 56, with salt and pepper hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, he was beloved by both the town's human and animal populations. He looked up from preparing his instruments when Sarah entered with the basket. "So this is our little patient," he said, smiling warmly. "Let's have a look." Sarah set the basket on the examination table and gently lifted the dog out, murmuring reassurances as Dr. Mitchell approached. The animal tensed but didn't struggle as the veterinarian began his examination. "Female, likely around 2 years old," he noted, checking the dog's eyes, ears, and mouth with practiced efficiency. "Definitely malnourished, but her teeth are in surprisingly good condition. Some skin issues. We'll need to treat for fleas and mange." He felt along her abdomen carefully. No obvious masses or tenderness. That's good. The examination continued methodically, with Dr. Mitchell commenting occasionally and Sarah assisting where needed. When he checked the dog's legs and paws, he made a discovery that caused his brow to furrow. "There's an old fracture here," he said, gently manipulating the dog's right hind leg. "It's healed, but not properly. Probably happened when she was quite young. It doesn't seem to be causing her pain now, but it might give her trouble as she ages." Sarah felt a tightness in her chest, imagining what this dog must have endured. "Will she need surgery?" she asked. Dr. Mitchell shook his head. "No, it's too well healed for that. It would do more harm than good to try to correct it now, but we'll need to be mindful of it." He straightened up, removing his stethoscope from around his neck. "Overall, she's in rough shape, but nothing life-threatening. I'd like to do some blood work to rule out any underlying issues, give her the necessary vaccinations, and start treatment for the skin conditions." "Of course," Sarah agreed readily. "Any plans for what you'll do with her afterward?" Dr. Mitchell asked, his tone casual, but his eyes sharp and assessing. Sarah hesitated. She hadn't thought that far ahead, having focused primarily on getting the dog immediate help. She looked down at the small creature, which was now leaning slightly against her hand on the examination table. "I don't know," she admitted. "I should probably check if anyone's reported her missing, though given her condition." "Seems unlikely she has a loving home waiting," Dr. Mitchell finished for her. "We can check for a microchip, but I wouldn't get your hopes up." He made a few notes on his tablet before continuing. "We could contact the shelter once she's stable, though they're pretty full right now. Or—" The unspoken suggestion hung in the air between them. Sarah knew what he was hinting at. She could keep the dog herself. The thought had crossed her mind, of course, but she'd pushed it aside, not wanting to make such a decision impulsively. "Let's focus on getting her healthy first," she said finally. Dr. Mitchell nodded, a knowing smile playing at the corners of his mouth. A wise approach. We'll run the test, start treatment, and go from there. He patted the dog gently. She's lucky you found her, Sarah. Not everyone would have stepped in like you did. As Dr. Mitchell prepared to draw blood for testing, Sarah continued to stroke the dog's head, noticing how the animal leaned into her touch more confidently now. There was a connection forming between them, tenuous but real. It reminded her of how her mother had always said that sometimes animals choose us rather than the other way around. "I think we need to call you something besides dog or little one," she murmured. The animal's ears perked up as if understanding that Sarah was addressing her directly. "Any ideas?" Dr. Mitchell asked, carefully drawing blood from the dog's front leg while Sarah kept her distracted. Sarah studied the small terrier, taking in her wheaten coat, intelligent eyes, and the quiet dignity with which she endured the examination, despite her obvious fear. "Hope," she said finally. "I think I'll call her Hope." The next 2 weeks established a new routine for Sarah and Hope. Each morning they'd wake early for a gentle walk, though Hope still startled at loud noises and cowered when strangers, especially men, approached too quickly. The prescription medications from Dr. Mitchell were gradually healing her skin conditions, and a proper diet had already begun to put healthy weight on her slight frame. Sarah had checked for missing dog reports and had Hope scanned for a microchip, but as expected, no owner came forward to claim her. She told herself she was still deciding whether to keep Hope permanently, but the growing collection of dog supplies in her apartment suggested her heart had already made the choice her mind wasn't quite ready to admit. "You're looking better every day," Sarah told Hope one evening as they settled on the couch, the dog curled against her thigh while she flipped through patient files on her tablet. Hope had grown comfortable enough to seek out physical contact, though she still maintained a certain wariness, as if expecting the comfort to be snatched away at any moment. A sudden wailing from the apartment next door made Hope's head jerk up, ears alert and body tense. Sarah stroked her reassuringly. "It's just baby Emma," she explained, though the dog obviously couldn't understand her words. "Mrs. Patel is babysitting for the Rosenthals tonight." Hope relaxed slightly, but continued to listen intently as the infant's cries persisted. After a few minutes, when the wailing showed no signs of abating, Sarah sighed and set her tablet aside. "I should go check if Mrs. Patel needs a hand," she told Hope. "You stay here, okay? I'll be right back." Hope watched with evident concern as Sarah headed for the door, but remained in her spot on the couch as instructed. Sarah had discovered that Hope was remarkably obedient, quickly learning basic commands despite her skittish nature, another indication that someone had trained her at some point before abandoning her to the streets. Sarah knocked gently on Mrs. Patel's door, which opened almost immediately to reveal her elderly neighbor looking frazzled, the red-faced, screaming infant in her arms. "Oh, Sarah, thank goodness," Mrs. Patel said, nearly shouting to be heard over Emma's impressive lung capacity. "I've tried everything. She's been fed, changed, rocked, but she won't stop crying. I was about to call Rachel and Daniel, but they so rarely get a night out." "Here, let me try," Sarah offered, holding out her arms. Mrs. Patel transferred the squalling baby with evident relief. "Why don't you take a little break? Make yourself some tea. I'll see what I can do." As Mrs. Patel retreated gratefully to her kitchen, Sarah gently bounced Emma, speaking in soft, soothing tones. The baby continued to cry, her tiny face scrunched in distress, though the volume decreased slightly as Sarah paced the living room. "What's wrong, little one?" Sarah murmured, checking the baby for any obvious signs of discomfort. Emma wasn't running a fever, and her diaper was indeed clean. She seemed to be in one of those inexplicable states of baby misery that sometimes defied adult understanding. After 10 minutes of continuous wailing, even Sarah's patience was wearing thin. She was about to suggest that perhaps they should call the Rosenthals after all, when there was a tentative scratch at the door. What on earth? Mrs. Patel emerged from the kitchen, brow furrowed. Sarah, still bouncing the crying Emma, moved toward the door and opened it cautiously. There, sitting in the hallway with an expression of grave concern, was Hope. Hope, how did you? Sarah began, then remembered she hadn't completely closed her apartment door in her haste to help Mrs. Patel. The dog rose to her feet, eyes fixed on the crying baby. To Sarah's surprise, instead of being frightened by the loud noise, Hope seemed worried. "Is that your dog, dear?" Mrs. Patel asked, peering over Sarah's shoulder. "Yes, I'm sorry. She must have pushed the door open when she heard me over here," Sarah explained, expecting Mrs. Patel to be upset about the intrusion. Instead, the elderly woman smiled. "Well, bring her in then. I've always believed animals have a special sense about babies." Hesitantly, Sarah stepped aside to let Hope enter the apartment. The dog moved carefully, approaching Sarah and the still crying Emma with deliberate slowness. Hope sat at Sarah's feet, looking up at the baby with her head tilted slightly, as if trying to understand the source of such distress. What happened next left both women speechless. Hope rose on her hind legs, placing her front paws gently on Sarah's leg to get a closer look at Emma. The baby's cries began to subside as she noticed the dog, her tear-streaked face registering curiosity. Hope made a soft whining sound, and to everyone's astonishment, Emma hiccuped once, then quieted completely, staring at the dog with wide, fascinated eyes. "Well, I never," breathed Mrs. Patel. "It's like she was just waiting for someone to introduce her to your dog." Sarah carefully lowered herself to the couch, still holding Emma, but allowing Hope to maintain visual contact with the baby. Hope remained attentive, occasionally making that same gentle whining sound whenever Emma showed signs of starting to cry again. Each time, the infant would refocus on the dog and calm down. "This is remarkable," Sarah said softly, watching the interaction with amazement. She had heard of therapy dogs having calming effects on people, but she'd never witnessed anything quite like this, especially from a formerly abused stray who was still healing from her own trauma. Over the next hour, Hope remained steadfastly by Emma's side. When Sarah placed the now drowsy baby in her portable crib, Hope settled on the floor nearby, maintaining her self-appointed guard duty. "Your dog is a natural," Mrs. Patel said, bringing tea for Sarah and herself. "I've never seen anything like it. Emma usually takes hours to settle when her parents are out." Sarah watched Hope, who was now resting her chin on her paws, but keeping her eyes fixed on the sleeping infant. "She's full of surprises," she murmured. When the Rosenthals returned later that evening, they were astonished to find their notoriously difficult-to-settle daughter sleeping peacefully under the watchful eye of a small terrier. "We can never find a babysitter because she screams the whole time," Rachel Rosenthal confessed, keeping her voice low. "How did you manage this miracle?" "It wasn't me," Mrs. Patel said, gesturing toward Hope. "It was Sarah's dog. She has a special way with Emma." Daniel Rosenthal, who worked as a child psychologist at Millfield General Hospital, knelt down to observe Hope more closely, careful not to make any sudden movements that might frighten her. "There's actually growing research on the therapeutic effects of animals on children," he said thoughtfully. "Some hospitals are implementing pet therapy programs with remarkable results." He looked up at Sarah. "Your dog is quite special." Sarah felt a surge of pride, watching Hope maintain her calm vigilance even with strangers in the room. For a dog who had every reason to distrust humans after what she'd endured, Hope's gentle nature with the baby was nothing short of extraordinary. As they prepared to leave, Rachel turned to Sarah with a hopeful expression. "Would it be possible? Would you consider bringing Hope over sometimes? Maybe for an hour or so in the evenings? We'd pay you, of course." Sarah was taken aback by the request. "Oh, I don't know. Hope is still recovering and she's quite nervous around new people. "Please," Rachel said, glancing at her peacefully sleeping daughter. "Even just once a week would make such a difference. Emma has colic and the pediatrician says she'll grow out of it eventually, but in the meantime..." Sarah looked at Hope, who seemed completely content in her role as baby guardian. Perhaps this could be good for her too. A purpose, a way to build confidence and positive associations with people. "We could try," she conceded. "Maybe start with short visits and see how it goes." The relief on Rachel's face was palpable. "Thank you. We live just down the hall, apartment 2F, whenever is convenient for you." After the Rosenthals had departed with Emma, and Sarah had returned to her own apartment with Hope trotting dutifully at her heels, she found herself marveling at the evening's unexpected turn of events. "You're full of surprises, you know that," she told Hope, who looked up at her with those intelligent eyes that seemed to understand far more than a dog should. "Where did you learn to be so good with babies?" Hope offered no explanation, of course, but settled into her bed with a contented sigh, as if satisfied with a job well done. Sarah watched her for a long moment, thinking about the remarkable connection she'd witnessed between the traumatized dog and the colicky baby. There was a depth to Hope that Sarah was only beginning to discover, an empathy that seemed at odds with the cruelty she must have experienced. It made Sarah wonder about Hope's past. Had she once been part of a family with a baby? Or was her gentle nature simply an innate part of who she was, something that even neglect and abuse couldn't extinguish? Whatever the explanation, Sarah knew one thing with certainty. The decision she'd been postponing had just made itself. Hope wasn't going anywhere. She had found her forever home. Over the next few weeks, Sarah and Hope settled into a new routine that now included regular visits to the Rosenthal apartment. What had started as brief tentative sessions had evolved into scheduled appointments 3 evenings a week, with Hope's calming presence working its magic on baby Emma consistently. "It's like night and day," Rachel told Sarah one evening as they watched Hope sitting patiently beside Emma's playmat, where the baby was happily batting at hanging toys. "Her pediatrician is amazed at the difference. She's sleeping better, eating better, even her digestion has improved." Sarah nodded, still somewhat bewildered by Hope's natural ability. "I've been reading about animal-assisted therapy. It's pretty remarkable what the right connection can do." "Daniel's been researching it too," Rachel said, lowering her voice even though her husband wasn't home yet. "He's actually talking to the hospital administration about starting a pilot program. He thinks Hope could be perfect for it." Sarah's eyebrows shot up in surprise. "Hope? But she's still so nervous around strangers, especially men." "Not with Emma, though," Rachel pointed out. "And Daniel says she's been more comfortable with him each time he's around. He thinks with the right training, she could work specifically with children. Nothing too overwhelming, just controlled environments, one child at a time." Sarah watched as Emma began to fuss slightly, immediately drawing Hope's attention. The dog inched closer, making that special whining sound that always seemed to soothe the baby. Sure enough, Emma's expression cleared, and she reached out a chubby hand toward Hope, who very gently allowed the baby to touch her nose. "I don't know," Sarah said uncertainly. "It's a big step from helping one baby to working in a hospital setting." Rachel nodded understandingly. "Of course. It's just something to think about. The program wouldn't start for months anyway. Lots of red tape to get through." She smiled. But Daniel was quite impressed when he saw how she helped Lucas yesterday. Lucas was the Rosenthal's 5-year-old nephew, who had been visiting with his parents. The boy had autism and had become overwhelmed by the unfamiliar apartment, retreating into a corner in distress. To everyone's surprise, Hope had approached him cautiously, lying down a short distance away until Lucas had eventually calmed enough to reach out and stroke her fur. "That was pretty amazing," Sarah admitted. I'd never have expected her to approach a child in distress like that, especially with all the noise. Daniel says she has a natural instinct for emotional needs, Rachel replied. It's rare, even among trained therapy dogs. Their conversation was interrupted by a knock at the door. Rachel rose to answer it, returning moments later with Dr. Mitchell, who had become a regular visitor to check on Hope's progress. "How's our wonder dog doing?" he asked, smiling at Sarah before approaching Hope and Emma cautiously. Hope had become comfortable with the veterinarian, recognizing him as someone who had helped her, but she still maintained a certain wariness around most men. "See for yourself." Sarah gestured to where Hope was now lying beside Emma, the baby's hand resting on her back as she gurgled happily. Dr. Mitchell observed the scene with evident satisfaction. "The blood work we did last week came back perfect. She's officially in excellent health, though we'll want to keep an eye on that leg." He lowered himself carefully to sit across from Sarah. "Have you thought any more about the therapy dog training?" Sarah sighed. "Does everyone know about this but me?" Dr. Mitchell chuckled. "Small town. Daniel Rosenthal mentioned it when he brought his cat in for vaccinations yesterday. I think it's worth considering, Sarah. Hope has a gift." "But she's been through so much," Sarah protested. "I don't want to put her in stressful situations when she's only just starting to feel secure." "I understand," Dr. Mitchell said gently. "And you're right to be cautious. But sometimes, helping others can be the best therapy for our own wounds." Sarah mulled over his words as she watched Hope with Emma. There was no denying the dog seemed to come alive in these moments, her usual anxiety receding as she focused entirely on the baby's needs. It was as though she transformed from a rescue animal to a confident caregiver, finding purpose in the connection. The training would be gradual, Dr. Mitchell continued. Daniel's program would start small, just 1 or 2 children at a time in controlled settings. Hope would be evaluated continuously, and if at any point it seemed too much for her, she could step back. "I'll think about it," Sarah promised, though she was still unconvinced. Later that evening, after returning to their apartment, Sarah sat on the floor with Hope, brushing her now lustrous coat. The dog leaned into the strokes, completely relaxed in a way that would have been unimaginable just weeks ago. "What do you think, girl?" Sarah asked softly. "Do you want to help other kids like Emma and Lucas?" Hope looked up at her with those soulful eyes, and Sarah wished, not for the first time, that the dog could tell her story. Where had she come from? Who had trained her, however briefly, before abandoning her to the streets? And how had she developed such an intuitive understanding of children's needs despite her own trauma? The following Saturday, Sarah took Hope to the small dog park on the edge of town. It was a risk. Hope was still nervous in unfamiliar surroundings and around other dogs, but Dr. Mitchell had suggested that controlled socialization would be good for her. They arrived early when the park was nearly empty, just one elderly man throwing a ball for his equally elderly Labrador at the far end. Sarah kept Hope on her leash initially, letting her explore the perimeter at her own pace, sniffing and marking territory as her confidence grew. "That's it," Sarah encouraged. "It's all safe here." After about 20 minutes, Hope seemed relaxed enough that Sarah decided to try letting her off the leash in the enclosed area. The dog stayed close at first, glancing back frequently as if to make sure Sarah was still there. "Go on," Sarah urged gently. "You can explore." Tentatively, Hope ventured a little further, her tail beginning to wag as she investigated the various scents and textures of the park. Sarah watched proudly, noting how far they'd come from the terrified creature huddled in that alley. The peaceful morning was interrupted by the arrival of a noisy family. Mother, father, and 3 children ranging from toddler to preteen, accompanied by an exuberant golden retriever who bounded into the park the moment the gate opened. Sarah tensed, worried that the sudden intrusion would overwhelm Hope. She moved to retrieve the dog, but before she could reach her, the situation took an unexpected turn. The youngest child, a girl of perhaps 2, broke away from her mother and toppled over on the uneven ground. Her wail of surprise and pain cut through the morning air, instantly drawing Hope's attention. To Sarah's astonishment, Hope trotted directly to the fallen child, all signs of her usual timidity vanishing as she approached, with the same focused concern she showed with Emma. The child's cries subsided as she noticed the small dog standing before her, head tilted inquiringly. The toddler's parents, who had rushed over, stopped short, watching in amazement as their daughter's tears gave way to curiosity. "Doggy," the little girl said, hiccuping slightly. Hope moved closer, allowing the child to touch her fur. The transformation was remarkable. The girl completely forgot her tumble, her face lighting up with delight as Hope patiently endured her somewhat clumsy petting. "I'm so sorry," Sarah said, hurrying over. "She usually doesn't approach strangers like that." "Please don't apologize," the mother replied, watching the interaction with evident wonder. "Lily was having a really tough morning. This is the happiest she's been all day." The father nodded in agreement. "Your dog seems to have a special touch with kids." "So I'm discovering," Sarah said, a slow smile spreading across her face as she watched Hope gently lick away a tear on the toddler's cheek, eliciting a giggle. Perhaps Dr. Mitchell and Daniel Rosenthal were right. Perhaps Hope's gift wasn't just something to protect, but something to share. The dog who had been rescued from cruelty might have an opportunity to bring healing to others who needed it. As they walked home from the park later, Hope trotting contentedly by her side, Sarah made her decision. Tomorrow she would call Daniel Rosenthal and ask about the therapy dog training program. It wouldn't be easy, and she would ensure that Hope's well-being remained the priority, but she couldn't deny what she had witnessed multiple times now. The dog who had once been the victim might have a calling to become a healer. The Millfield General Hospital's pediatric wing was quieter than usual on this Tuesday morning. Sarah stood in the corridor, nervous energy radiating through her body as she waited with Hope at her side. The small terrier wore her brand-new therapy dog vest, a blue fabric garment with official patches that had arrived just yesterday, marking the culmination of 3 months of intensive training. "You're going to do great," Sarah murmured, more to herself than to Hope, who seemed remarkably calm despite the unfamiliar environment. The dog had exceeded everyone's expectations during the training program, displaying a natural aptitude for the work that had impressed even the most experienced handlers. Daniel Rosenthal rounded the corner, his face lighting up when he spotted them. "There's our star team," he said warmly, crouching down to greet Hope at her level. The dog's tail wagged gently in recognition, a far cry from the fearful creature who had once trembled at the approach of any man. "How are you feeling?" Daniel asked, rising to address Sarah. "Nervous," she admitted. "Is that normal?" "Hope seems fine, but my stomach is in knots." Daniel laughed. "Completely normal. The handlers are often more anxious than the dogs. But you've both been thoroughly prepared, and we're starting with just one patient today. A good match for Hope's temperament." He led them down the corridor toward a room at the end of the hall, briefing Sarah as they walked. Jason is 7 years old, recovering from surgery after a car accident. Physically, he's healing well, but he's withdrawn, refusing to engage with the physical therapists or even his parents. He hasn't spoken since waking up after surgery, though the neurologist can find no physical reason for it. Sarah nodded, absorbing the information. This was exactly the kind of case where Hope's special connection with children might make a difference. "We'll keep the first session short," Daniel continued, "just 15 minutes. The goal isn't to push for immediate results, but to establish a comfort level. Jason's parents will be present, but they've been instructed not to interfere." They paused outside the door to Jason's room. Sarah took a deep breath, then looked down at Hope, who gazed back up at her with complete trust. "Ready, girl?" Hope's tail wagged once in response. The room was softly lit, with colorful murals of forests and wildlife adorning the walls in an attempt to make the sterile hospital environment less intimidating. A small boy with a cast on his arm and another on his leg sat propped up in the bed, his gaze fixed on the window. He didn't turn when they entered, though his parents, a tired-looking couple seated beside the bed, looked up hopefully. "Jason," Daniel said gently, "I've brought some visitors today. This is Sarah and her dog, Hope." The boy made no response, not even a flicker of acknowledgement. Daniel nodded to Sarah, who led Hope closer to the bed, stopping a few feet away to give Jason space. "Hi, Jason," Sarah said softly. "Hope and I are here to keep you company for a little while, if that's okay." Still no response. Sarah glanced uncertainly at Daniel, who gave her an encouraging nod. "Hope is a therapy dog," she continued, keeping her voice gentle and conversational. "That means her job is to visit people in the hospital and help them feel better. She's still in training, actually. This is her very first official visit." Something in her words, perhaps the admission of Hope's novice status, seemed to register with Jason. His eyes shifted slightly from the window, though he still didn't look directly at them. "Would you like to meet her?" Sarah asked. For a long moment there was no response. Then, almost imperceptibly, Jason nodded. Sarah guided Hope closer to the bed, keeping the leash loose. "She's very gentle. You can pet her if you'd like." Hope, as if sensing the delicacy of the situation, approached with extraordinary care. Instead of trying to get onto the bed or demand attention, she simply sat beside it, looking up at Jason with patient eyes. The boy finally turned to look at the dog. His face remained expressionless, but his eyes, dark with shadows no child should bear, focused intently on Hope. After a moment, he slowly extended his uninjured arm, his fingers hovering just above Hope's head. Hope remained perfectly still, allowing the child to make the first contact. When Jason's small hand finally came to rest on her fur, she closed her eyes briefly in contentment, her tail sweeping gently across the floor. The room was silent except for the soft beeping of medical equipment. The adults watched, hardly daring to breathe, as Jason began to stroke Hope's head with increasing confidence. The dog leaned slightly into his touch, offering comfort, without demanding anything in return. After several minutes, Sarah noticed tears streaming silently down Jason's face. The boy made no sound, but his hand trembled slightly against Hope's fur. Without prompting, Hope rose up on her hind legs, placing her front paws carefully on the edge of the mattress to get closer to Jason. With gentle precision, she licked a tear from his cheek. The sound that escaped Jason then was somewhere between a sob and a laugh, the first noise he had made since the accident, according to the sharp intake of breath from his mother. Hope continued to lick his face tenderly, and suddenly the dam broke. Jason wrapped his good arm around the dog's neck, burying his face in her fur as his small body shook with silent sobs. Sarah glanced at Daniel, uncertain whether to intervene, but he shook his head slightly. This was exactly what needed to happen. Jason's mother had risen from her chair, one hand pressed to her mouth as tears filled her own eyes. His father stood beside her, an arm around her shoulders, both watching as their son expressed the grief and fear he had been unable to release. When Jason's sobs finally subsided, he kept his arm around Hope, who had somehow managed to slide part of her body onto the bed without disturbing any of the medical equipment. The dog rested her head on Jason's lap, completely at ease despite the emotional intensity of the moment. "She got hurt too," the boy whispered, his voice raspy from disuse. The words were so unexpected that it took Sarah a moment to realize Jason had spoken. "Yes," she confirmed gently. "Hope was hurt before I found her. Some people weren't kind to her." Jason's fingers traced the small scar still visible on Hope's ear. "But she got better." She did, Sarah said. It took time, and she still gets scared sometimes, but she's very brave. Jason nodded solemnly, as if this made perfect sense to him. I got scared in the car when it crashed. I thought I was going to die. His mother made a small sound, but Daniel held up a hand, silently urging her to let the moment unfold. That must have been terrifying, Sarah said softly. Jason nodded again, his fingers still stroking Hope's fur. I dream about it. The noise. The pain. He looked up at Sarah for the first time, his eyes wide and haunted. Will I get better like Hope? The question, so simple yet so profound, caught Sarah off guard. Yes, she said firmly, blinking back her own tears. Yes, you will. It might take time, like it did for Hope. You might have days when you feel scared or sad, and that's okay. But you will get better. Jason seemed to consider this, his gaze returning to Hope, who was watching him with unblinking devotion. Can she come back tomorrow? Sarah looked to Daniel, who nodded with a smile. Hope would love to visit you again, Jason. We'll come back tomorrow. As they prepared to leave, the 15 minutes had stretched to nearly 30 without anyone noticing. Jason's mother approached Sarah, her eyes red but her face transformed with relief and gratitude. Thank you, she whispered, squeezing Sarah's hand. The doctor said he would speak when he was ready, but it's been weeks. We were starting to lose hope. Sarah smiled, looking down at the small dog who had accomplished what teams of medical professionals couldn't. Sometimes, she said, hope comes in unexpected packages. As they walked back down the corridor, Daniel couldn't contain his enthusiasm. That was remarkable, he said. To get him talking in the very first session, it's beyond what any of us anticipated. Sarah nodded, still processing the powerful interaction she had witnessed. It wasn't me, she said. It was all Hope. She knew exactly what he needed. Daniel shook his head in wonderment. You know, when I proposed this program, there were skeptics on the hospital board who thought it was just a feel-good gimmick. If they could have seen what happened in that room today. Sarah looked down at Hope, who trotted contentedly beside her, seemingly unaffected by the emotional weight of what had just transpired. The small dog who had once been kicked and abandoned in an alley had just helped begin the healing of a deeply traumatized child. She's incredible, Sarah said softly. And as Hope glanced up at her with those intelligent, compassionate eyes, Sarah knew that this was only the beginning of their journey together. Word of Hope's success with Jason spread quickly through Millfield General Hospital. What had begun as a modest pilot program with one dog and one handler rapidly evolved into something much larger. Within a month, Sarah and Hope were visiting the hospital 3 times a week, working with children suffering from various physical and emotional traumas. Each session seemed to reveal new dimensions to Hope's remarkable abilities. She somehow knows what each child needs, Sarah explained to Dr. Mitchell during Hope's monthly checkup. With Jason, she's playful and energetic, encouraging him to move despite his casts. But with Lily, the leukemia patient, she's incredibly gentle. She'll just lay her head on the bed for hours while the girl sleeps. Dr. Mitchell nodded, finishing his examination of Hope's previously injured leg. The leg is holding up well, even with the increased activity, he noted, and she's maintaining a healthy weight. Physically, she's in excellent condition. He straightened up, smiling at the dog who sat patiently on his examination table. Emotionally, she's thriving. This work is good for her, Sarah. Sarah couldn't disagree. The nervous, skittish dog she'd rescued from that alley had transformed into a confident, purposeful animal. Hope still had moments of anxiety, particularly around loud noises or aggressive men, but her progress was remarkable. The hospital administration is talking about expanding the program, Sarah said as she helped Hope down from the table. They want to bring in more therapy dogs. Daniel asked if I'd help train the new handlers since Hope has been such a success. You should do it, Dr. Mitchell said without hesitation. You and Hope have a special gift for this work. As they left the clinic, Sarah reflected on how much her life had changed in the months since rescuing Hope. What had begun as a simple act of kindness had evolved into a new career path. She still worked part-time at the veterinary clinic, but increasingly, her days were filled with therapy sessions, training, and now potentially teaching others. The local newspaper had run a feature on Hope the previous week, complete with photographs of the small terrier wearing her therapy vest while visiting patients. The response had been overwhelming, with the hospital receiving donations specifically earmarked for expanding the therapy dog program. Even more surprising was the message Sarah had received that morning from a producer at a national morning show, requesting an interview with her and Hope. The producer had seen the newspaper article online and thought their story would inspire viewers across the country. "What do you think, girl?" Sarah asked as they walked home. "Are you ready for your television debut?" Hope trotted alongside her, seemingly unconcerned with her growing celebrity status. When they arrived at their apartment building, Mrs. Patel was waiting in the lobby, waving a copy of the newspaper excitedly. "Sarah, dear, have you seen the letters to the editor today? Everyone is talking about our Hope." Sarah smiled, accepting the paper Mrs. Patel thrust into her hands. Indeed, the letters section contained no fewer than 3 messages from community members praising Hope's work at the hospital. One was from Jason's mother expressing profound gratitude for the dog who had helped her son find his voice again. "She's becoming quite the local hero," Mrs. Patel continued, bending to pat Hope, who accepted the attention graciously. "And to think those horrible boys were kicking her just a few months ago." Sarah's smile faltered slightly at the reminder. Despite Hope's remarkable recovery and new purpose, Sarah still felt a surge of anger whenever she thought about the cruelty the dog had endured. Occasionally, she found herself scanning the streets for the teenagers, especially the one in the red hoodie who had seemed to be the ringleader, though she'd never seen them again. "Heroes often come from unlikely places," she said finally, pushing the dark thoughts aside. "Hope has certainly proven that." Later that evening, as Sarah prepared dinner, her phone rang. It was Daniel Rosenthal. "Sarah, you're not going to believe this," he said without preamble. "The video." "What video?" Sarah asked, confused. "Someone took a video of Hope with Eliza yesterday, you know, the 8-year-old burn victim who hadn't let anyone touch her scars. When Hope gently licked her hand and then lay beside her." "Yes, I remember," Sarah said, still not understanding his excitement. "Well, apparently one of the nurses recorded it on her phone and shared it with Eliza's mother, who posted it on social media this morning. It's gone viral, Sarah. Over 2 million views already." Sarah sat down abruptly. 2 million? But how? "People are calling it a miracle," Daniel continued. "The way Hope somehow knew to approach the exact area that was causing Eliza the most distress, both physically and emotionally. The way the child went from complete withdrawal to actually smiling, it's powerful stuff." Sarah's mind raced. She hadn't even known they were being filmed. "Is that allowed? I mean, with patient privacy and everything?" Eliza's mother got proper clearance before posting. She wanted people to see what had helped her daughter, and she credited the hospital program with your and Hope's names. Daniel paused. "The hospital's phone has been ringing nonstop. Media requests, donations, people asking how they can start similar programs in their cities." "Wow," Sarah breathed, looking over at Hope, who was contentedly chewing a dental treat on her bed, completely unaware of her newfound internet fame. "There's more," Daniel said. "Dr. Friedman from Children's Hospital in Boston called. They want to consult with us about implementing a program based on our model. And they specifically asked if you and Hope could come demonstrate your techniques." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. "Boston? That's That's a big deal, Daniel. It's huge, he agreed. Children's is one of the top pediatric hospitals in the country. If they adopt our program, others will follow. This could literally change the standard of care for thousands of children. After ending the call, Sarah sat for a long time processing the implications. When she'd stepped into that alley to confront those teenagers, she could never have imagined where that moment would lead. A dog who had been the victim of cruelty was now at the center of a movement that could transform children's health care. The following week was a whirlwind. The national morning show sent a crew to Millfield, transforming a corner of the pediatric ward into a makeshift studio. With special permission from parents and hospital administration, they filmed Hope in action with several of her regular patients, capturing the small dog's extraordinary intuition and gentleness. Sarah found herself answering questions about Hope's background, training methods, and the science behind animal-assisted therapy. Throughout it all, Hope remained perfectly composed, as if she'd been preparing for this moment her entire life. "What do you think makes Hope so special?" the interviewer asked Sarah during their sit-down segment. Sarah looked down at the terrier sitting calmly beside her chair. "I think sometimes those who have experienced great pain develop a unique capacity for empathy. Hope knows what it's like to suffer, to be afraid, to feel abandoned. Somehow, that's translated into an ability to connect with children who are experiencing their own versions of those same feelings." The interviewer nodded thoughtfully. "It's remarkable that after what she endured, she still trusts humans enough to do this work." "That's what amazes me every day," Sarah admitted. She had every reason to give up on people, but instead, she's devoted herself to helping the most vulnerable among us. In many ways, she's taught me more about resilience and forgiveness than I could ever teach her. As the crew packed up their equipment, the hospital administrator approached Sarah with an official-looking envelope. "The board wanted me to give you this personally," she said, handing it to Sarah, "in recognition of what you and Hope have accomplished." Inside was a formal letter offering Sarah a full-time position as director of the newly established Animal-Assisted Therapy program at Millfield General, complete with a salary that was nearly double what she earned at the veterinary clinic. "We're expanding," the administrator explained. 6 more dogs to start, with plans for more as we secure additional funding. We need someone with your expertise to oversee it all, someone who understands both the animals and the patients. Sarah stared at the letter, momentarily speechless. Less than 6 months ago, she'd been a veterinary assistant with no clear career path, still grieving her mother and feeling adrift. Now she was being offered a leadership position in a groundbreaking program that she and Hope had helped create. "Can I think about it?" she asked finally. The administrator smiled. "Of course, but we're hoping you'll say yes. What you and Hope have started here, it's something special, Sarah. Something that deserves to grow." That night, as Sarah sat on her couch with Hope curled against her side, she reread the offer letter, trying to wrap her mind around this new future that had opened before them. The small dog looked up at her with those soulful eyes, as if sensing the weight of the decision before them. "What do you think, Hope?" Sarah asked softly. "Are we ready for this next chapter?" Hope's tail thumped once against the cushion, a quiet but definitive yes. 6 months into Sarah's tenure as Director of Animal-Assisted Therapy at Millfield General, the program had expanded beyond anyone's expectations. What had begun with 1 small terrier and a handful of pediatric patients now included 6 certified therapy dogs working across multiple departments. Hope remained the star, however, with a waiting list of patients specifically requesting her services. On this particular Tuesday morning, Sarah stood in the hospital lobby surrounded by camera crews and reporters. The governor was visiting to present a state recognition award to the program, highlighting its innovative approach to patient care and the measurable improvements in recovery rates since its implementation. "This is quite the operation you've built," remarked Dr. Mitchell, who had taken the morning off from the veterinary clinic to attend the ceremony. "Your mother would be so proud, Sarah." Sarah smiled, feeling a familiar bittersweet pang at the mention of her mother. She would have loved all of this, especially Hope. She glanced down at the terrier sitting calmly at her feet, impeccably groomed and wearing her therapy vest adorned with new patches recognizing her advanced certification. "Speaking of our star," Dr. Mitchell said, "how's the leg holding up with all this additional work?" "Better than expected," Sarah replied. "We're careful with her schedule, and the new hydrotherapy sessions seem to be helping with the stiffness." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of the governor and her entourage. The ceremony itself was brief but heartfelt, with the governor sharing stories she'd heard from parents about the program's impact on their children's recovery. Several former patients had been invited to speak, including Jason, now fully recovered from his injuries and attending school again. "Before Hope," the boy said, his voice clear and confident as he addressed the crowd. "I couldn't talk about what happened in the accident. I was too scared. But she showed me it was okay to be afraid sometimes. She was afraid too, but she was still brave." Sarah blinked back tears as Jason continued, describing how his twice-weekly sessions with Hope had given him the courage to face his physical therapy, his nightmares, and eventually his return to school. "Hope taught me that bad things happen, but you don't have to let them stop you," he concluded, looking down at the terrier with obvious affection. After the ceremony, as the crowd began to disperse, Sarah noticed a woman hovering at the edge of the gathering, her attention fixed on Hope. There was something in her posture, a tension, an intensity, that made Sarah instinctively protective. She moved closer to Hope, who was receiving gentle pats from Jason and his parents as they prepared to leave. The woman approached slowly, her eyes never leaving the dog. She was in her 50s perhaps, with graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and a weathered face that spoke of outdoor work. "Excuse me," she said, her voice soft but urgent. "That dog, may I ask where you got her?" Sarah felt a flicker of unease. Over the past year, as Hope's story had spread through traditional and social media, they'd occasionally encountered people claiming to be her original owners, usually with transparent motives of cashing in on her newfound fame. "She's a rescue," Sarah replied cautiously. "I found her about a year ago." The woman nodded, her eyes still fixed on Hope. "A Wheaten Terrier mix with a healed fracture in her right hind leg?" Sarah stiffened. That detail hadn't been publicized. "Who are you?" "My name is Margaret Lawson," the woman said. "I run a small farm about 30 miles from here." She hesitated, then continued. I think that's Daisy." "Daisy?" Sarah repeated, confused. "My therapy dog. She disappeared almost 2 years ago." Hope, or Daisy, had noticed the woman now and was watching her with curious attention, head tilted slightly but showing no sign of recognition or distress. "Perhaps we should continue this conversation in my office," Sarah suggested, suddenly aware of the remaining reporters still lingering nearby. Once they were seated in Sarah's small but tidy office, with Hope settled on her bed in the corner, Margaret Lawson explained her story. She operated a therapeutic riding center for children with disabilities, where she also trained service and therapy dogs. Daisy had been one of her most promising trainees, showing an extraordinary aptitude for working with children on the autism spectrum. "She was about a year old when she disappeared," Margaret said, her voice tight with controlled emotion. "I'd taken her and 2 other dogs to an outreach event at a school in Millfield. When it was time to leave, I loaded everyone into the van, but there was a commotion with one of the horses we'd brought. In the confusion," she spread her hands helplessly. "By the time I realized Daisy was missing, we'd already driven halfway home." "You came back to look for her?" Sarah asked. Margaret nodded. "Immediately. For weeks afterward, I put up posters, contacted animal control, visited shelters, but she had a microchip. I couldn't understand why no one had called. Sarah felt a cold weight in her stomach. When I found her, she was in terrible condition, malnourished, injured, absolutely terrified of humans, especially men. Dr. Mitchell, our veterinarian, he did scan for a microchip, but nothing showed up. They can migrate, Margaret said softly, or fail. It happens. She looked over at Hope, who was watching them with intelligent eyes. May I? Sarah hesitated, then nodded. Margaret moved slowly from the chair to kneel on the floor a short distance from Hope's bed. She didn't try to touch the dog or call her, but simply sat, palm extended. Hey there, sweet girl, she murmured. It's been a long time. Hope studied the woman for a long moment. Then, to Sarah's surprise, she rose and approached Margaret cautiously. She sniffed the outstretched hand thoroughly before taking a step closer to sniff Margaret's face and hair. Suddenly, Hope's tail began to wag. Not the polite professional wag she gave to patients, but a whole-body wiggle of unmistakable recognition and joy. She pressed herself against Margaret, who finally wrapped her arms around the dog, burying her face in Hope's fur. Daisy, she whispered. Oh, my Daisy. Sarah watched, her throat tight with conflicting emotions. The evidence was undeniable. Hope clearly remembered this woman. After all this time, after everything they'd been through together, Sarah was facing the possibility of losing her. After a few moments, Margaret composed herself, though she kept one hand on Hope's back as the dog settled beside her on the floor. She's doing such important work, Margaret said, gesturing around the office with its wall of thank you cards from patients and photographs of Hope with various children. I can see she's found her calling. She's transformed our program, Sarah agreed, choosing her words carefully. The techniques she's developed are being implemented in hospitals across the country now. Margaret nodded, pride evident in her expression. That's what she was trained for from the very beginning, to help children heal. She looked directly at Sarah. I'm not here to disrupt that. Sarah blinked, not quite understanding. What do you mean? I mean, Margaret said gently, that I didn't come to take her away from all this. I just needed to know she was all right. She stroked Hope's head tenderly. When I saw that news segment about the miracle therapy dog in Millfield, something about her eyes, I had to see for myself. Relief flooded through Sarah, followed immediately by guilt. But she's your dog. You trained her. You searched for her. Margaret shook her head. She was my dog, but now she's clearly yours. And more importantly, she belongs to all those children who need her. I would never interfere with that. Sarah studied the older woman, seeing the genuine love she had for Hope, the painful sincerity in her eyes. What happened to her? She asked quietly. Between when she disappeared and when I found her, she was so traumatized, so afraid. Margaret's expression darkened. I've pieced together bits from talking to local animal control. Apparently a family found her after the event and took her home. No report filed, no attempt to locate her owner despite her tags and collar. She sighed heavily. When she chewed up some expensive shoes, they abandoned her. Just drove to another town and left her in a park. From there, who knows how many hands she passed through before ending up on your streets. Sarah felt the familiar anger rising at the thought of Hope, Daisy, being discarded so callously. So much suffering, she murmured. And yet, somehow, she never lost her compassion. That's who she is, Margaret said simply. That's what makes her special. The two women sat in silence for a moment, both watching the dog who had, in her own way, brought them together. I'd like to know her story, Sarah said finally. All of it. How you found her, how you trained her, if you'd be willing to share that. Margaret's face brightened. I'd like that very much. Hope, and Sarah wasn't quite ready to think of her as Daisy yet, looked between the two women, her tail sweeping gently across the floor as if approving of this unexpected alliance. Over cups of tea in Sarah's apartment that evening, Margaret shared the story of how a small Wheaten Terrier puppy had come into her life. Hope, or Daisy, as Margaret had named her, had been the runt of a litter born to a working farm dog. The farmer, a friend of Margaret's, had planned to sell the puppies, but wasn't sure the smallest would find a home. The moment I saw her, Margaret recalled, there was something in her eyes, an intelligence, a sensitivity that stood out even at 8 weeks old. I wasn't looking for another dog, but I couldn't leave her behind. Hope lay between them on the couch, her head resting on Margaret's lap while her body pressed against Sarah's side, a physical representation of the connection now forming between the two women. She took to training like she was born for it, Margaret continued, absently stroking Hope's ears. Most therapy dogs require months of socialization and specialized training, but Daisy... She glanced apologetically at Sarah. Sorry, Hope. She seemed to understand instinctively what was needed. That's exactly what Daniel Rosenthal said when we started the hospital program, Sarah replied. That she had a natural instinct most handlers spend years trying to develop in their dogs. Margaret nodded. It's extraordinarily rare. I've trained dozens of therapy and service dogs over the years, and I've never seen anything quite like her ability to read emotional needs. She smiled down at the contented dog. That's why losing her was so devastating, not just personally, but because of the potential she represented for helping children. And now she is, Sarah said softly, helping children every day. Thanks to you, Margaret replied. If you hadn't intervened that day in the alley, if you hadn't recognized her potential despite her condition. She shook her head, unable to complete the thought. Their conversation continued late into the evening, with Margaret sharing training techniques she had used with the young Daisy, and Sarah describing the methods that had helped Hope overcome her trauma and anxiety. As they talked, both women realized they had much to learn from each other. I've been thinking, Sarah said as the evening wound down. Would you consider consulting for our program? The hospital has been pushing to expand, but finding handlers with the right instincts is challenging. Your experience would be invaluable. Margaret looked surprised but pleased by the suggestion. I'd be honored. I've scaled back operations at the farm in recent years. My arthritis makes the physical work with the horses difficult, but this would be perfect. Before Margaret left, they stood together in the doorway, watching as Hope performed her bedtime ritual of circling her cushion 3 times before settling down. She seems happy, Margaret observed. Truly happy. I hope so, Sarah replied. I've tried to give her the best life possible. You've done more than that, Margaret said, squeezing Sarah's arm gently. You've helped her fulfill her purpose. There's no greater gift. The next morning, Sarah arrived at the hospital with both Hope and Margaret in tow. Daniel Rosenthal was ecstatic to meet the woman who had initially trained their star therapy dog, peppering her with questions about early socialization techniques and behavioral indicators of aptitude for therapy work. This is incredible, he said, as they walked toward the pediatric wing for Hope's first session of the day. Having insight into Hope's early training could help us refine our selection process for new therapy dogs. Their first patient that morning was Eliza, the burn victim whose video with Hope had gone viral. The 8-year-old's physical wounds were healing well, but the emotional scars of the house fire that had claimed her father's life were still raw. Today marked a significant milestone, her first session without her mother present, a step toward rebuilding her independence. Are you sure you're ready to try this alone? Sarah asked gently as they stood outside Eliza's room. The girl nodded, her jaw set with determination despite the anxiety evident in her eyes. "Hope will be with me. I'll be okay." Sarah glanced at Margaret, who had been briefed on Eliza's case. The older woman gave a subtle nod of approval at the child's resolve. Inside the room, Eliza sat on the edge of her bed, the scarring still visible on her arms and neck. When Hope entered, the dog made a beeline for the girl, her tail wagging in greeting. Eliza's tense posture relaxed visibly as she bent to embrace the terrier. "Hey, Hope," she whispered. "I missed you." Margaret observed from the doorway as Sarah guided the session, noting the seamless communication between handler, dog, and patient. Hope seemed to anticipate Eliza's needs moment by moment, alternating between playful engagement when the girl's mood dipped and gentle, calming presence when anxiety spiked. "Today we're going to try something new," Sarah explained, setting a small container on the bed. "This is a special cream that will help your scars heal and become less uncomfortable. Would you like to try applying it yourself?" Eliza hesitated, eyeing the container warily. Until now, only the nurses and her mother had applied the medication, as Eliza refused to touch or look at her own scarred skin. Hope, sensing the girl's unease, gently nudged the container with her nose, then looked up at Eliza expectantly. The message was clear. This is nothing to fear. Slowly, Eliza reached for the container, opening it with trembling fingers. Sarah demonstrated the application technique on her own arm first, then waited patiently as Eliza gathered her courage. With Hope watching attentively, the girl finally dipped her fingers into the cream and began to apply it to her scarred forearm. Tears welled in her eyes, but she continued, her focus shifting between the task and Hope's encouraging presence. "You're doing great," Sarah murmured, careful not to overwhelm the moment with too much praise. When Eliza finished, Hope placed a gentle paw on her knee and licked her hand once, a clear sign of approval that brought a wobbly smile to the girl's face. "She's proud of me," Eliza said, wonder in her voice. "We all are," Sarah confirmed. Later, as they walked to their next appointment, Margaret shook her head in amazement. That was remarkable. The way Hope knew exactly how to encourage her without pushing too hard. "That's what makes her so effective," Sarah agreed. "She seems to understand the precise balance between comfort and challenge that each child needs." The rest of the morning unfolded similarly, with Hope working her magic across various departments. In the oncology ward, she lay perfectly still beside a sleeping toddler, offering silent comfort to the exhausted parents. In physical therapy, she playfully motivated a reluctant 12-year-old to complete his exercises by retrieving tennis balls he threw as rewards for each set. During their lunch break, as Hope rested in Sarah's office, Daniel joined them with an excited gleam in his eye. "I've just gotten off the phone with the Children's Hospital Association," he announced. "They want to develop standardized protocols based on our program for implementing animal-assisted therapy nationwide. And they want both of you involved." Sarah and Margaret exchanged surprised glances. "Both of us?" Sarah asked. Daniel nodded enthusiastically. Sarah's experience developing the hospital program, combined with Margaret's background in training and early identification of suitable dogs, it's the perfect partnership. They're proposing a series of workshops and a comprehensive manual that could become the gold standard for pediatric therapy dog programs. "That's a much bigger platform than I ever imagined," Sarah said, feeling slightly overwhelmed by the prospect. "It's a chance to help thousands of children," Margaret pointed out, her eyes bright with possibility. "To create more success stories like Eliza and Jason." "And it all started with Hope," Daniel added, looking fondly at the sleeping terrier. "One small dog with an extraordinary gift." That evening, as Sarah and Margaret sat on a bench outside the hospital watching Hope explore a patch of grass nearby, they continued to discuss the proposal. The scope of the project would require significant time and commitment from both of them, but the potential impact was undeniable. I never imagined my life taking this direction, Sarah admitted. A year ago, I was just a veterinary assistant trying to get through each day, still grieving my mother. Life has a way of surprising us, Margaret replied. When I lost Daisy, Hope, I thought that chapter of my work was over. Now it seems it was just the beginning of something much larger. Hope returned to them, settling at their feet with a contented sigh. Both women reached down simultaneously to stroke her fur, their hands briefly touching in a moment of shared purpose. "Partners?" Margaret asked, extending her hand formally. Sarah smiled, clasping the offered hand firmly. "Partners." Hope looked up at them, her intelligent eyes seeming to understand the significance of the moment. Her tail thumped against the ground in approval of this new alliance, one that would carry her special gifts to children far beyond the walls of Millfield General. Spring had bloomed in Millfield, bringing with it a sense of renewal that seemed fitting for the next phase of Hope's remarkable journey. The pilot workshop for the National Therapy Dog Program was scheduled to begin in 2 days, with animal specialists, hospital administrators, and potential handlers arriving from across the country to learn the methods Sarah and Margaret had refined over the past 3 months. Sarah sat on a bench in the small park near her apartment, watching as Hope explored the fresh grass, her nose working overtime to catalog all the new scents of the season. The dog's confidence had continued to grow, though she still maintained a cautious distance from groups of teenagers, a lingering effect of her encounter in the alley that Sarah suspected would never fully disappear. "Taking a break from preparation, Dr. Mitchell asked, appearing on the path with his elderly Labrador Max, who greeted Hope with a dignified wag of his tail. "Trying to clear my head," Sarah admitted as the veterinarian joined her on the bench. "I never thought I'd be teaching a national workshop on anything, let alone something that didn't exist in Millfield a year ago." Dr. Mitchell chuckled. "Life has a way of taking unexpected turns. But if anyone can handle it, it's you and Margaret. The work you've done together these past few months has been extraordinary." It was true. Since discovering Hope's origins, Sarah and Margaret had developed a powerful synergy, combining Margaret's expertise in early training with Sarah's insights into rehabilitation and clinical applications. Together, they had expanded Millfield's program to include 12 therapy dogs, each matched with handlers specially selected for their emotional intelligence and adaptability. "How's the collaboration going with Children's Hospital in Boston?" Dr. Mitchell asked. "Better than expected," Sarah replied. "They've already implemented the initial protocols we developed, and the results are promising. They're sending 3 representatives to the workshop." Dr. Mitchell nodded approvingly. "And I heard rumors about a book deal?" Sarah smiled, still slightly embarrassed by the attention. "It's not final yet, but yes, there's interest in publishing our methodology along with Hope's story. The publisher thinks it could help both professionals and the general public understand the therapeutic potential of the human-animal bond." Their conversation was interrupted by Hope's sudden alertness. The terrier had frozen, her attention fixed on a figure approaching along the path from the opposite direction. Sarah followed her gaze and felt her stomach tighten. Though it had been more than a year, she instantly recognized the teenager in the red hoodie, the same boy who had been kicking at Hope that rainy day in the alley. He was alone this time, head down, hands shoved in his pockets. He hadn't noticed them yet, and Sarah felt a momentary impulse to gather Hope and leave before a confrontation could occur. But something made her stay put. Perhaps it was curiosity, or perhaps a sense that this encounter was somehow necessary, a circle that needed closing. Dr. Mitchell, sensing her tension, looked questioningly between Sarah and the approaching teenager. "Someone you know?" "In a manner of speaking," Sarah replied quietly, placing a reassuring hand on Hope's back. The dog had not retreated in fear, which surprised her, but remained alert and watchful. The boy looked up as he drew nearer, his eyes widening in recognition, first of Sarah, then of Hope. He stopped abruptly, uncertainty written across his face. He was thinner than Sarah remembered, with dark circles under his eyes suggesting troubles of his own. For a moment, no one moved or spoke. Then, to Sarah's astonishment, Hope took a single step forward, her posture neither aggressive nor fearful, simply attentive. The boy, Jake, Sarah recalled his name from that day, swallowed visibly. That's the dog," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "From the alley." Sarah nodded, keeping her hand lightly on Hope's back. "Her name is Hope." Jake's gaze shifted between them, a complex mixture of emotions crossing his face. I've seen her on the news, the therapy dog." He hesitated, then added in a rush, "I didn't know it was the same dog until now." Dr. Mitchell, comprehending the situation, murmured something about checking Max's arthritis and tactfully moved a short distance away, giving them privacy while remaining within sight. "Why did you do it?" Sarah found herself asking, the question that had lingered in her mind whenever she thought of that day. Why hurt an animal that had done nothing to you? Jake looked down, scuffing his sneaker against the path. "I don't know," he mumbled, then seemed to reconsider. "No, that's not true. I do know I was angry, all the time, at everyone." He glanced up briefly. "My dad had just gone to prison. My mom was working 2 jobs. Everything felt like it was falling apart, and I just wanted to make something else hurt too." The raw honesty of his response took Sarah by surprise. She had expected excuses or defiance, not this vulnerable admission. "I'm not saying it was right," Jake continued, the words coming faster now, as if a dam had broken. "It wasn't. It was messed up. I knew it then, and I know it now." He looked directly at Hope, who was watching him with that uncanny perception she brought to all her interactions. "When I saw her on TV, helping those kids at the hospital, I couldn't believe it was the same dog, that she could go from what we did to her to helping people like that." "She's remarkable that way," Sarah said softly. "She doesn't let her past define her." Jake nodded, swallowing hard. "After that day, after you stopped us, I couldn't stop thinking about it. About what you said, about how what we were doing was abuse, not fun." He took a deep breath. I started volunteering at the animal shelter, just cleaning cages at first, but now I help with the dogs, walking them, basic training stuff." Sarah blinked in surprise. Of all the outcomes she might have imagined from this chance encounter, this was not one she had considered. "The shelter on Oak Street?" she asked. "Yeah. Ms. Rodriguez says I have a knack for the scared ones, the ones that have been through bad stuff." A flicker of pride crossed his face, quickly replaced by shame as he glanced at Hope again. "Probably because I used to be the bad stuff." There was a beat of silence, broken only by the distant sounds of children playing in another part of the park. Then, to Sarah's amazement, Hope moved forward, closing the distance between herself and Jake. She stopped just in front of him, looking up with clear, steady eyes. Hesitantly, the boy crouched down, bringing himself to her level. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm so sorry." Hope regarded him for a long moment, her expression inscrutable. Then, with deliberate gentleness, she extended her paw, placing it on his knee in the same gesture she used with patients who needed encouragement. Jake's eyes widened, a tear spilling over and tracking down his cheek. "She does that with children who are struggling," Sarah explained quietly. "It's her way of saying, I see your pain, and I'm here." "But how can she, after what I did?" "That's who she is," Sarah said simply. "That's her gift." Jake carefully extended his hand, allowing Hope to sniff his fingers before venturing a gentle stroke along her back. The dog accepted the touch calmly, her eyes never leaving the boy's face. "The workshop we're holding this weekend," Sarah said, the idea forming as she spoke. "For therapy dog handlers. We need volunteers to help with setup and registration. It's not glamorous work, but it would be a chance to see what this program is all about." Jake looked up, surprise and cautious hope in his expression. "You'd let me help, even knowing?" "Everyone deserves a second chance," Sarah said, thinking of Hope's journey from abused stray to healing presence. "Hope taught me that." As they exchanged contact information, with Jake promising to arrive early on Saturday to help with preparations, Sarah marveled at the unexpected turn the day had taken. The angry boy who had once tried to harm Hope was now volunteering with rescue animals and would soon be supporting the very program she had inspired. Dr. Mitchell rejoined them as Jake continued down the path, his posture noticeably lighter than before. "I gather that was one of the teenagers from the alley?" he asked. Sarah nodded, watching Hope, who seemed completely unfazed by the encounter. "It seems Hope's talent for healing extends beyond the hospital walls." The veterinarian smiled. "I'm not surprised. The most powerful therapy often happens outside clinical settings." He looked thoughtfully after Jake's retreating figure. That boy may have just experienced the most important session of his life. As they walked home, with Hope trotting contentedly between them, Sarah reflected on the intricate web of connections that had formed since that rainy day in the alley. Margaret, Daniel, the children at the hospital, and now even Jake. All lives touched and transformed by one small dog who had every reason to give up on humanity, but had instead become a channel for healing. And in 2 days, the circle would widen further, as new handlers from across the country learned to foster similar connections in their own communities. The ripples of Hope's journey were spreading far beyond what anyone could have imagined, one paw print at a time. The conference room at Millfield General hummed with anticipation as handlers, dogs, and healthcare professionals from across the country gathered for the final day of the workshop. The past 3 days had been a whirlwind of demonstrations, lectures, and hands-on training sessions, all centered around the methodology Sarah and Margaret had developed with Hope as their inspiration. Sarah stood at the back of the room, observing with quiet satisfaction as Margaret guided the participants through a final exercise in recognizing stress signals in therapy dogs. Hope lay at Sarah's feet, seemingly unfazed by her role as the catalyst for this gathering, though she occasionally perked up when her name was mentioned. "You've created something extraordinary here," remarked Dr. Elaine Chen, the Director of Pediatric Services at Children's Hospital in Boston. "We've already seen remarkable results implementing your protocols, even in these early stages." "It's been a team effort," Sarah replied, watching as Jake, true to his word, moved efficiently among the participants, distributing handouts and answering basic questions with growing confidence. The teenager had thrown himself into the volunteer role with unexpected dedication, staying late each evening to help prepare for the next day and absorbing every bit of information like a sponge. "The boy has potential," Dr. Chen observed, following Sarah's gaze. "He has that same intuitive quality you mentioned in your lecture, the ability to read a situation without being told." Sarah nodded, remembering how Jake had instinctively stepped in yesterday when one of the participating dogs had become overwhelmed, creating a quiet space for the animal to decompress before anyone else had even noticed the signs of stress. "He's hoping to apply for the junior handler program at the shelter," she said. "If he continues on this path, I could see him becoming an excellent therapy dog trainer one day." Dr. Chen smiled. Redemption comes in many forms. As the workshop session concluded, participants broke into small groups for final discussions before the closing ceremony. Sarah made her way to the podium, preparing her notes for the address she would deliver shortly. The prospect of speaking before this distinguished audience still made her nervous, but the passion she felt for the work overcame her natural reticence. A soft commotion at the door drew her attention. Mrs. Patel had arrived with the Rosenthals, Rachel, Daniel, and 15-month-old Emma, now walking confidently and chattering in the half-formed language of toddlers. Hope immediately perked up, her tail wagging in recognition. "We couldn't miss the closing ceremony," Rachel explained as they approached. "Not when Hope and Emma's story is such a big part of what started all this." Indeed, the case study of Hope's effect on Emma's colic had been featured prominently in the workshop materials as an example of the intuitive connection therapy dogs could form with patients of all ages. Emma, spotting Hope, let out a squeal of delight and toddled toward the dog with outstretched arms. "Hup! Hup!" she called, her approximation of Hope's name bringing smiles to everyone nearby. Hope rose to greet the child, her body language soft and welcoming as Emma wrapped her arms around the dog's neck in an enthusiastic but gentle hug. The terrier licked the little girl's cheek once, eliciting a cascade of giggles. "It's still amazing to me," Rachel said, watching the interaction with wonder in her eyes. "Before Hope, we couldn't put Emma down for even a minute without her screaming. Now look at her, confident, happy, secure." "Hope has that effect on people," Sarah replied, remembering the countless similar transformations they had witnessed over the past year. "She helps them find their own courage." As the time for the closing ceremony approached, participants returned to their seats, many with their therapy dogs settled beside them. Jake took his place at the back of the room, standing a little straighter than he had on the first day, the burden of his past mistakes visibly lighter on his young shoulders. Margaret joined Sarah at the podium, the two women exchanging a smile of shared accomplishment before Sarah turned to address the audience. "When I stepped into an alley on a rainy evening to confront some teenagers who were tormenting a stray dog," she began, "I had no idea that moment would change not only my life but the lives of countless children and families." She glanced down at Hope, who had taken her customary position beside the podium. "I've been asked many times what makes Hope special, what quality allows her to connect so deeply with children in pain. The truth is, I think it's because she understands suffering from the inside out." Sarah continued, sharing the key insights they had gathered through their work with Hope and the other therapy dogs in the program. She spoke of the scientific evidence supporting animal-assisted therapy, the protocols they had developed for matching dogs with specific patient needs, and the importance of understanding the unique language each therapy dog used to communicate with their charges. "But beyond the methodology and the measurable outcomes," she concluded, "this work is about moments of connection that transform both the giver and the receiver of comfort. It's about a child finding their voice again, a dog finding their purpose, and all of us witnessing the profound healing that can occur when we recognize and honor the bond between humans and animals." As the applause filled the room, Sarah caught sight of Dr. Mitchell at the back, standing beside Mrs. Patel. Both were beaming with pride. Beside them stood Jake, his expression thoughtful as he absorbed the impact of the program he had unwittingly helped create through his actions that rainy day. The formal proceedings concluded with the distribution of certification materials and a final question-and-answer session. As the participants began to disperse, many paused to thank Sarah and Margaret personally or to give Hope a final pat of appreciation. "We've received invitations to bring the program to 6 more hospitals," Margaret told Sarah as they gathered their materials. "And the publisher called this morning. They want to fast-track the book for release in the fall." Sarah nodded, still somewhat overwhelmed by how quickly everything was expanding. "I keep thinking about all the children who'll be helped by this work, children we'll never even meet." "Hope's legacy," Margaret said softly, watching as the terrier allowed Emma to lead her around the now emptying conference room, the toddler's small hand resting on her back. Jake approached them hesitantly, waiting until the last participants had departed before speaking. "I just wanted to say thank you," he said, his gaze moving between Sarah, Margaret, and Hope, "for letting me be part of this. It's meant a lot." "You've been a tremendous help," Sarah assured him. "In fact, we were wondering if you might be interested in a more formal role with the program. We're establishing a youth mentorship component, and someone with your perspective would be invaluable." The boy's eyes widened in disbelief. "Me? But I'm the one who's demonstrated remarkable growth and commitment," Margaret finished for him firmly. "The past informs us, Jake, but it doesn't define us. Hope taught us that." As if hearing her name, Hope detached herself gently from Emma and trotted over to them, looking up at Jake with clear, knowing eyes. After a moment's hesitation, the boy crouched down to her level. "What do you think, girl?" he asked softly. "Should I do it?" Hope's response was to place her paw on his knee, the same gesture of encouragement she had offered in the park, the same connection she formed with the children who needed her most. Jake looked up at Sarah, a smile breaking across his face. "I guess that's a yes." Later that evening, after all the participants had departed and the hospital had quieted for the night, Sarah took Hope for a final walk through the pediatric ward. Many of the children were already asleep, but a few looked up with drowsy smiles as the familiar therapy dog passed their doors. In the small garden courtyard at the center of the hospital, Sarah sat on a bench beneath a flowering cherry tree. Hope settled contentedly at her feet. The stars were just becoming visible in the darkening sky, and a gentle spring breeze carried the scent of new blossoms. "You've come a long way, you know that?" Sarah murmured, stroking Hope's silky ears. "From that terrified little dog in the alley to changing how children heal across the country." Hope looked up at her with those wise, gentle eyes that seemed to hold all the understanding in the world. Her tail swept once across the ground, a simple acknowledgement of a journey completed and a new one beginning. Sarah thought of all the lives that had been touched by this one small dog. Emma and Jason, Eliza and countless other children at the hospital, the handlers who had attended the workshop and the patients they would go on to help, even Jake, whose act of cruelty had inadvertently set this entire story in motion. From the darkness of that rainy alley to this moment of quiet triumph, Hope had transformed not just herself but everyone around her, creating ripples of healing that would continue to spread long after her own story ended. And that, Sarah reflected as Hope settled her head on her lap with a contented sigh, was perhaps the greatest miracle of all. How the dog that everyone had given up on had become a beacon of possibility, a living reminder that even in our darkest moments, hope remains.